Ladies and gentlemen, he is Claude Baissac, former president of
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, I suppose, everyone. Claude Baissac here. I'm currently in Johannesburg, South Africa. Couple words about Unomics, the firm that I founded and lead. Our focus is very much around resilience and resilience in fragile states. We work all over Africa. We work in the Middle East, Central Asia, Latin America, and we bring together risk management, strategy, and growth consultancy for governments and corporates. It's quite interesting to be in this world, this COVID world, where a lot of the work we do has become essential for our clients' resilience. I have done a lot of work on SEZs. I was indeed, for a few years, the president of the Special Economic Zones Association, WEPSA. I started my career on SEZ. I have probably done about 45 projects all over the world, but it's not really my day job. It's more of intellectual interest. I'll speak a bit about globalization and what I think is going on in relation to the pandemic, and then we'll talk about SEZs and SEZs in this new, brave new world. I think that what we're seeing really is not necessarily something exactly new, that the pandemic has radically altered the global environment. I think that actually it simply confirms some of the development we've seen, and I'll go back. The previous speaker talked a lot about World War I. I think it's an apt analogy, it's an apt point of reference. So we speak about deglobalization with the sense that COV2 is going to have a fundamental impact on that. Yes and no. If we look at some of the key statistics about globalization, we do see, in a way, some fundamental changes in the drivers of globalization. The movement of capital and good or the growth in the movement of capital and goods has slowed down, but the movement of people has continued to grow. I think that's going to be now a major change, obviously. And obviously, the growth of information and connectivity is absolutely staggering and enormous. And in fact, if we look at the DHL Global Connectedness Index, it has risen from 100 in 2001 to 120 in 2013, and it has plateaued since. But I don't quite buy the deglobalization story, particularly if we take a 200-year perspective, looking at exports and FDI. And they show very much that globalization has worked in cycles of expansion and recession within a broadly expansionary trajectory. And FDI, for instance, has expanded extraordinarily since the 1980s, not perfectly correlating with trade. So we can't take a short view, a 2 to 3 year view, or 4 years or 5 years view as to what is happening and make a judgment call. But what is clear is that we have experienced over the past 20 years an extraordinary rise in global instability, crisis, and uncertainty. We had a brief period of unipolarism, and that didn't last very long. And we've entered in a period of world disorder. Geopolitical tensions are the highest since the 1980s. And we can see that through a number of indicators. But the interesting thing is that while we are seeing an increase in geopolitical tension, uncertainty, economic crisis, and the likes, the past 20 years have also seen unprecedented gains in poverty reduction and growth, particularly in the global south. And there, globalization, the support for globalization remains very strong. And where you can see that most of the growth over the past 20 years has taken place in the global south, Western Asia, South Asia, obviously East Asia, Eastern Europe, not so much in Africa. But what is clear is that the 2007-2010 crisis, global economic crisis, and the accompanying rising inequality have undermined faith in globalization, particularly in the old West and power, and then fed economic nationalism, protectionism, and trade wars. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind these long cycles. And it's very important to not take a purely materialistic reading of globalization. Yeah, we measure globalization through trade flows, people, person flows, and exchanges, capital flows. But globalization is very much an outcome of geopolitics. And I will remember conversations I used to have in the 1990s when I used to live in the US. At the time of Alan Greenspan, you know, and the notion that we had reached the end of history and kind of a post-ideological, post-historical world where politics and political leadership didn't matter, and where it was all about, you know, monetary controls, integration, and the most important man in the world was Alan Greenspan. Obviously, me being a political scientist, historian, and economist, I couldn't believe any of that. And it didn't last very long. You know, for me, 2001 is kind of the moment where history knocks back at the door of the West. So, you know, if we take a very long-term view of history, what do we see? We see that we have these phases of, and we're looking at here at military expenditures per countries and per group of countries. So we have to understand that the world for the past 200 years, I mean, since the defeat of Napoleon, yes, 1815, has effectively been dominated by the Anglo-American project of institutional free trade, institutions, cooperations, etc. But there have been challenges to that rule. The German-Japanese challenge of the 1900s to 1945, followed by the Soviet challenge, and now the China challenge. And each of these challenges have had different outcomes. The German-Japanese challenge was profoundly disruptive to the global economic system and ended up in two wars, which resulted into the 1945 New World Order. The Soviet challenge, however, occurred in competing economic systems and was balanced by the nuclear theory of mutually assured destruction. The Chinese challenge, interestingly enough, which we are now experiencing, began first as an economic project within the global economy, within the global market rules, you know, of the kind of WTO, United Nations system, and then at the political one after 2010. And the current slowdown in trade and financial flows tend to correspond with that. So, you know, there clearly are those cycles, and we clearly are, you know, at the beginning of something new, which undoubtedly is impacting globalization, trade flows, investment flows, international cooperation, etc. And as for SEZs, well, what's interesting about them is that they are very much a product of globalization. And in my interpretation of them, in my view of them, my analysis of them, they have been, their niche has been experimentation and diffusion of innovation. They've spearheaded trade, they've spearheaded fiscal and exchange policy innovations. They have spearheaded and led cross-border integrations, usually at first on an experimental basis, tentatively. They anticipated production sharing. I can think about what was happening early on in the 1950s between Puerto Rico and the United States, and then between Mexico and the United States. That model then replicated itself through the countries of East Asia, the Tigers, and then went global and at an incredible pace, an incredible scope when China entered the world of SEZs. They have also catalyzed entrepreneurship and technology transfer. I mean, if I look at my own country of Mauritius, the country transitioned from a certain level of traditional exports of colonial staples to exports of manufacturing goods and textile, thanks to the EPZ, but not content of just being on the receiving end of European orders and American orders, but fulfilled by Hong Kong Chinese firms. The local Mauritians, facilitated by the Mauritius Commercial Bank, decided to launch themselves into that. And today, 70–80% of the firms in the EPZ are Mauritian owned. And in some particular commodities, Mauritius has a greater real competitive advantage than anyone in the world, including China. But a bit of a history there. So in the 1820s to the 1900s, there were very few EPZs, SEZs, and they were mainly Freeport Islands, Hong Kong, Singapore, Panama of empires. In the 1900s, 1920s, the concept of foreign trade zones, free trade zones, took hold. And then in the 1920s, 1940s, in Barcelona and in the United States, and Puerto Rico, there were some thinking around how do we industrialize in the post-world. We take benefit of the American market, and we put together the concept of free trade zones and of the industrial zone together. It's kind of Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico, and then the maquiladoras, and then the first true EPZ, the Shannon Free Zone in 1958, which take place in the GATT system of exchanges. And that's very, very important to understand, because we are regulated by a system of trades that have very clear rules, and that both follow kind of what happens in the world and also anticipate it, and then have fundamental transformational implications. And I think what we are living now could have huge implications on the rules of the game, our relation to trade. So in the 50s and 70s, EPZs were effectively job creation addendums to import substitution strategies in emerging countries. And then we have the Irish and we have the East Asian innovation of export-led growth, using EPZs for foreign direct investment, technology transfer, and control liberalization with a kind of dual economic system. And this period of history is very misunderstood by a lot of economists. 1980s, obviously, it's the Chinese invention of the special economic zones as a multi-sector place of living, not an industrial enclave, but literally a whole region where everything and everybody is in the SEZ. And it has differential rules on the market and trade and investment and capital repatriation and labor laws, etc. What's very interesting, if we look at this curve, and I'll go back to it here, I'll put it back here, is the post-95, post-WTO, I was, in 95, I was doing an internship, first consultancy at UNCTAD, and I remember a lot of economists there saying, well, now EPZs, SEZs are going to disappear because they have no raison d'etre. There will no longer be any, meaningful duties imposed, and therefore we should see them as completely irrelevant. And in fact, their numbers, the number of countries who use them, and their number exploded during that period. And why is that? Well, because in fact, SEZs are more than about trade, and they are really concentrates of infrastructure, business facilitation, social capital, and the critical piece of competitiveness and innovation. If you want to read a bit more about the history of SEZ, I have a little reference there. There's a World Bank book that I wrote a couple of chapters back in 2011 with a man called Tom Farrell, but I'll make this presentation available. So where is globalization going? With changes in geopolitics, understanding that geopolitics has always been the driver of globalization, even if the difference in the American system, Anglo-American post-1945 order, was a complete change in the understanding of the relationship of politics and economics. Not the kind of French, German continental mercantilism, where economic relations are purely power economic relations, but where, and I think it's important, I have a little quote coming to that. There we go. This is the Atlantic Charter of 1941. Churchill and Roosevelt met in Newfoundland and really saw that the causes of World War II and World War I were economic competition, but in a negative way, negative sum games. And so to further, to create a completely new dispensation and a new system, where the field of economics is not one of competition in a negative geopolitical sense, power political sense, but one of cooperation and co-investment and learning. And this is unique in the history of the world. This kind of Pax Americana, which did its job in the sense that it literally, and the globalization system literally today still rests on the United States and the European project commitment that their enormous markets be open to trade and to capital, both incoming and outgoing. And that system underwrote global growth waves. Europe in the 1950s through the Marshall Plan, the Western aligned Third World in the 60s and 80s to the 80s, the post-Soviet world and China in the 1990s and 2000s. And now this world is very much under threat. Primarily, and that's the paradox, from the US and Europe themselves, who are now reluctant participants to globalization. You know, surveys show that you know, those countries that have most benefited from globalization in the past and kind of rooted the system are now the most critical and the most doubtful of its benefits. And that's quite normal because they now have competition. But they've also, I think, played with, in my view, with the devil by hyper-financializing their economies, which has made it very, very unequal and very susceptible to the kind of 1920s, 30s populism that took down the world trading system. We have another phenomenon which is contributing to fundamental questions about the future of globalization, and that's China's ambition towards greater China in East Asia, and obviously its global political economy dominance, the One Belt, One Road project, for instance, and obviously how the US is reacting to that, which is leading to a threat of an economic delink and possibly the rise of two competing economic spheres of influence with competing forms of capitalism. One perhaps a bit more free market, American fundamental, and the other one more state capitalistic with kind of mixtures of 19th century gunboat diplomacy, stick and carrot, and integration in the great Chinese cooperation sphere. I'm sorry to say that, that's deeply offensive, I take it back. But obviously globalization is unlikely to end. It's likely to morph around these competing spheres with differing patterns and rules of trade, capital, people, and information flows, creating both threats and opportunities. What about the pandemic in that? Well, it's clearly not a natural disaster, but a social catastrophe caused by human activity. And it's also not a black swan. It's what we call a gray rhino. We could see it coming, we just didn't pay attention. You know, its onset and spread have been enabled by globalization and accelerated by mistrust between the powers. We have caused COV2, and it is exploiting our vulnerabilities. It is undoubtedly a threat to globalization, at least the current form of globalization. It has obviously traversed the rift between China and the United States. It has been enabled by geopolitics and is being ruthlessly exploited by narrow geopolitical interests, dangerously so. International cooperation, institutions, and solidarity have been cast aside in a massive governance failure, obviously. And the shutdown in the global economy, as we are currently experiencing, is a catastrophic reversal of the essence of globalization. And here, I think I go back to what the previous speaker said, you know, about World War I, and it's quite interesting that the 1918 pandemic happened in the context of geopolitical challenge. And in fact, after a brief period of trade expansion, contributed to deglobalization for a period of time, and war. And I think we need to be alive to the seminal importance of the moment we live in. How seminal, it's too early to tell. There's no way we can understand something by simply looking at 2 months back or now. That's why we need historical metaphors and analogies. But what is clear is that the current geopolitical context, the catastrophic governance of the pandemic, the shock realization by all of us of how vulnerable society is, all of these will accelerate shifts in globalization. And I think most likely relocalization, regionalizations, bi or multipolarism, re-regulation, and rediscovery of the fundamental role of the state in regulating and controlling things, and a return to the concept of economic sovereignty. And in that context, what are SEZs? Are they a tool of resilience, or are they a resilient tool for any global order? I view them as a highly adaptable concept and tool, which has survived many changes, and will be able to adapt to whatever comes, and will probably play an important role. Existing SEZs will have to adapt and share their business model if they are to survive, likely through localization and regionalization. SEZ in the global north might become important instruments of economic recovery and improved competitiveness. Joe, I read your article, your recent article of a few days ago, and I think it's a very important point. I think the United States is going to have to look very closely at this. I tried through the IEDC a few years ago. There were no takers, but I think maybe the time has come. Obviously, if there is a great link between China and the US, which I think is unavoidable and is being accelerated by the pandemic, that will provide new opportunities for regions that have not been effectively integrated, Africa being one. But they might have to choose, hedge their bets. We are likely to see a return of protectionism, which might lead to kind of a return not to the pre-GATT world, but the kind of GATT world. So we have WTO, and it's not very strong, and countries kind of choose the rules they apply, and abide to, and then we see a return to preferential market access, privileging allies and friends, and in that particular reality, SEZ would provide a competitive, controlled environment combined with places like smart cities and the like. I think that's kind of where we are going. And yeah, I'm opening to questions. Interesting question. How can SEZ become anti-fragile, not just resilient? I don't think there's anything as anti-fragile. I think what our experience is showing us is that the things we thought were solid are not. The institutions, the countries, the relationships, the functions of the world economy we thought were solid are not. I think we made some fundamental mistakes about globalization and system theory. We completely misunderstood that an integrated system is going to be far more susceptible to chaos than separated systems. It's not surprising that we're having all these shocks with greater amplitude and frequency. It's a system we built, and we built it partly through theoretical mistakes. That doesn't mean that we should walk away from trade integration, investment integration, innovation, and cooperation. I think we need to find a more balanced system. I have a question here about making government irrelevant. I think the opposite is going to happen. It's also the great paradox of global governance is that we have these massive societies, these massive countries. We've never had anything like that in history. And we have tremendous challenges of representation and legitimacy and policy and capacity. But what we're seeing is that people in the face of massive uncertainty are reverting to really local nationalistic, patriotic reflexes. And I think that's going to last. For me, what we have is really, we have a fundamental problem in how we've designed this thing, is that we have this global economic system, and we have obviously global realities of climate change, environmental change, etc. But yet we're framing the governance of our global reality in terms of very parochial systems of government, of local representations. And I think that's COVID is showing us how failed that is. And I'm not so I'm an anarchist by political tradition. I don't like governments, I don't like rules, but I'm also a realist in the sense that we need institutions, and without institutions there is no possibility to regulate human relations. We need to really rethink our global governance framework. And I don't think, I'm not a free marketer. I mean, I really am not. The free market without adequate regulation, without powerful states, just concentrates power in a few hands. And we see it. And we don't have free market. We have corporatism, and we have gangsterism and cronism. And that's what we see in the United States, in Russia, in China, in South Africa. Liberalization hasn't really been liberalization. It has served a lot of the elites who were in political power and now have both political and economic power. In Africa, so I think we need something entirely new in terms of global governance. The role of African countries in the geopolitical competition between the US and China. Yeah, look, Africa has really missed its entry into globalization, and it keeps on doing that every 20, 30 years. I did a lot of work in the past 10 years or so on the relationship between growth in Africa and the commodity boom and the rise of China. And we can very much see that it was that. And we can see now the prospects of African growth collapsing because of the death of their market. The US doesn't have much of an interest in Africa. It has only seen Africa from a prism, security prism. China has understood that Africa is a very important political and economic goal for them, cynically, I think, in a way. And it's essentially about resource grabbing. I think Africans need to really take the measure of the fact that they are alone in the world, and that their development is going to have to be based on very opportunistic kind of East Asian, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, after the war. They're not there, and I know because I work with a lot of the governments. They are way behind, and unfortunately that's the case. Yeah, North Africa is very interesting. I think Tunisia, Morocco are doing some very interesting things. Guys, this is great. Am I out of time?
Yes, but thank you very much for being with us. It was very interesting. People in the chat were
Thank you.
And I'm sure some of them will contact you after.
Lovely. Thank you so very much, and that was great.